In the morning, I was hurrying to water the flowers before work when I heard a familiar yet almost forgotten sound of an engine. Turning my head, I froze in place. An old green van with peeling paint and rusty doors. The very same van that used to take me to school, to picnics, and saved me from boring days. The driver was Mike, my stepfather. He looked a little older, but that same confident gaze and warm smile instantly took me back to my childhood. Mike had always been more than just a stepfather to me. He became my protector and mentor when I lost my father. And although we hadn't seen each other in a long time, his sudden appearance stirred conflicting feelings in me, joy and anxiety at the same time. Another person got out of the van. Tall, thin, with a sharp gaze, he gave me a slight handshake and introduced himself as Scott. The stranger exuded confidence, yet he was reserved and silent. "I thought you'd already forgotten me," Mike said, hugging me, and there was a warm tease in his voice. "Forget you? You always show up unexpectedly like snow in April." I smiled, though inside I felt a strange unease. "What brings you here?" "Just decided to visit old friends, and maybe lend a hand if needed. This is Scott, an old buddy of mine. He's good with everything. We figured we'd show him around some of my old haunts." Mike's words sounded calm, but something in his tone made me uneasy. This wasn't just a friendly visit. Mike was clearly holding something back, but I didn't ask questions right away. "Well, welcome then," I replied, trying to hide my concern. Scott looked at me carefully as if reading my thoughts, but said nothing. He just tilted his head toward the van and said, "We have something for you here. How about we take a look?" I nodded, though the tension inside me was growing. Mike opened the trunk and I saw it was crammed with tools and building materials. "We thought we could help with your yard," Mike said. "You've got such a huge plot here, I remember how you used to dream of turning it into a garden. So why not?" The idea was unexpected but pleasant. The plot behind the house had really needed some care for a while, and Alex, my husband, had been putting it off. But it still seemed strange that Mike had come up with such an offer. Why now? Why didn't he give me a heads up? When I led them into the house, Mike settled in quickly, as if he'd never left, while Scott looked around, not missing a detail. Their visit was sudden, but it seemed friendly. Or was it just me imagining things? Alex greeted the guests with joy, as if we had been expecting them all week. He was that kind of person. Open, kind, always ready to help and adapt. We lived a calm life without much disruption. Our life followed a routine: morning coffee, discussing plans for the day, occasional walks in the park. Everything was cozy, stable, and honestly, a little boring. "Mike, old buddy." Alex enthusiastically shook his hand. "You can't imagine how happy I am to see you. And this must be your friend?" "Scott." The man introduced himself, smiling faintly. "We just came to work and get a little rest. Hope we didn't disturb you." "Disturb us? Are you kidding?" Alex laughed. "It's actually nice to have a bit of liveliness." Liveliness. The word seemed to get stuck in my mind. It was definitely needed, but with each passing day, I wondered more and more. Why had our life become so predictable? We were both busy, took care of each other, but there was no longer that spark that had once accompanied us. We talked not about dreams, but about plans. We didn't laugh until we cried, but merely smiled politely. Even when he hugged me, it felt familiar, almost mechanical. Mike and Scott, on the other hand, brought a new kind of energy. When Mike told jokes or stories from the past, Alex laughed genuinely. And Scott listened carefully, occasionally adding precise, sometimes sharp comments that made you think. It was interesting, lively, something we had long lacked in our everyday life. In the evening, during dinner, I was making Alex's favorite shrimp pasta. Mike helped me chop vegetables, just like old times. It felt strange having him nearby again, but also warm. "So, tell me, how's everything going here?" Mike asked, handing me a cutting board with chopped onions. "Everything's fine," I shrugged. "Work, home, a little bit of worry." just like everyone else. And how about you? Scott unexpectedly asked, sitting nearby, slightly leaning back in his chair. His gaze was penetrating. Not you all, but you. Are you happy with your life? The question caught me off guard. I instinctively wiped my hands on a towel to buy a few seconds. No one had ever asked me so directly. Usually people were interested in family life, career, the external attributes. But here, it was me. What did I want? Well, I think yes, I replied, offering an uncertain smile. Scott didn't say anything, but his gaze made it clear. He understood that my answer wasn't exactly the truth. Fortunately, Mike changed the subject, starting to tell something funny about our past, and everyone laughed. But I couldn't relax anymore. That question kept echoing in my head. When everyone went to bed, I lay awake for a long time, unable to fall asleep. Alex was breathing peacefully beside me. I stared at the ceiling and thought about how the life I was so sure of just yesterday suddenly didn't seem so simple anymore. The next day, Mike and Scott got to work first thing in the morning. They brought with them an incredible amount of tools: shovels, saws, and some strange device I had never seen before. Mike suggested starting with clearing the backyard, which had long become a chaotic pile of weeds and branches. Alex enthusiastically supported the idea and immediately began to help. His excitement was almost contagious. I decided to do my part and started preparing lunch. I didn't want to leave the men hungry after their work. Everything was going smoothly, and I almost began to believe that this unexpected visit was just a kind gesture. Scott, however, continued to evoke mixed feelings in me. He didn't joke much, but there was always a sense of determination in his words and actions. When he started working on the old, almost falling apart fence, he said almost challengingly, "This fence reminds us how often we cover up something broken instead of fixing it." "Do you always speak in riddles?" I asked, handing him a glass of water. "Only when I see that people understand," he replied with a slight smile. I didn't know what to say and simply turned away, pretending to hurry back to the kitchen. Later, when we were all sitting down to lunch, the atmosphere seemed warm and cozy. Mike was telling stories from my childhood. His voice was even, and there was a particular tone when he spoke of the times he had helped me through difficulties. I remembered how he had once built a swing for me in the very spot where we were now clearing the weeds. "You used to love sitting there in the evenings," Mike said, smiling. "You could spend hours just watching the sunset, and then you'd make wishes, remember?" "I remember," I replied, trying to hide my unease. "I think half of them never came true." "Because wishes only work if you believe in them yourself," Scott chimed in. He was looking at me again as though he wanted to say something but was holding himself back. Alex, who was usually an active participant in any conversation, suddenly became noticeably more serious. He ate in silence, occasionally adding short comments to the conversation, but it was clear that something was bothering him. "You know," Mike suddenly said, turning to Alex, "your backyard is a real treasure. You could create a spot here that would be perfect for a picnic for an entire village." Alex nodded, and I could tell his mind was somewhere far away. Perhaps he was also thinking about how our life had become too predictable. In the evening, we went back to the backyard. Mike and Scott started discussing a plan to rebuild the fence and create a small rest area with benches. Alex suggested adding a lamp near the old tree so that we could enjoy the light in the evenings. "And you?" Scott asked, turning to me. "What would you want for this backyard?" I I don't even know," I replied, taken off guard by the sudden question. "I guess just a place to relax. Maybe a garden." "A garden is good," Scott said. "It requires patience, but if you take care of it, it gets more beautiful every year." It almost sounded like advice, not just about the yard. I felt that there was a hint of something deeper in those words, but I didn't delve into it. At that moment, I noticed that Mike looked at Scott in a particular way. There was something in his gaze that made me uneasy. It felt like there was a secret between them that I didn't know. Late in the evening, when everyone had gone off to their own tasks, Mike stayed with me in the kitchen. Alex had gone to the garage to sort through the tools, and Scott was sitting on the porch, enjoying the fresh air. Mike and I were left alone with a cup of tea, just like we used to do years ago. Everything felt so familiar, yet there was an odd new sensation hanging in the air. You know, Mike began, smiling as he looked at the cup in his hands. I still remember when you were learning to ride a bike. Do you remember? You must have fallen 5 times before you could ride even a couple of meters. I couldn't help but smile. Those moments seemed so distant, yet so significant. Do you remember the time you built a shelter for me out of old boards? I was sure it was a real castle. I laughed, but deep inside I felt a warm wave of memories. Of course I remember. You spent an entire week demanding that I call you Princess. Mike laughed too, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. Those were good times. His words stirred something long forgotten inside me. Once, Mike had been my rock, the only person who understood me when no one else did. After I lost my father, he taught me to believe that everything could be endured. But years had passed, and our bond had weakened. His visit now seemed so unexpected that I couldn't shake the thought. Why now? You've changed, he said suddenly, interrupting my thoughts. I remember you as rebellious, stubborn. Now it's like you've quieted down. Did life change you like this? I hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Mike's words made me wonder. Had I really changed? Or had I simply lost that part of myself that used to burn so brightly? Maybe I just grew up, I replied evasively. You know, growing up isn't an excuse to lose what makes you feel alive. He looked at me the way he used to when I was a child, when I was afraid to admit I had done something wrong. His gaze was filled with care, but now there was also a hint of concern. In that moment, I experienced a strange déjà vu. Mike had always known how to touch a nerve, how to make me think. And although his words were gentle, they left a mark on me. The conversation was interrupted when Alex peeked into the kitchen, saying he wanted to discuss the tools with Mike. I was left alone, feeling a strange mix of warmth and melancholy wash over me. Sitting by the window, I gazed out at the dark garden, listening to the wind rustling through the leaves. For some reason, memories from the past began flooding back one after another. How Mike once saved me from the neighborhood boys who mocked my clumsiness. How he taught me to fish. How he told me that I could achieve anything if I wasn't afraid of challenges. I hadn't thought about those times in a long while. But now, sitting alone in the kitchen, I realized how much Mike had shaped my life. His words, his actions, everything had become part of who I was. But then, why did his arrival stir such anxiety in me? The next day, after breakfast, Scott offered to help me sort through old things in the attic. Alex and Mike were busy with the tools, and Scott, as always calm and quiet, was surprisingly willing to follow my requests. As we climbed the stairs, I had the feeling that he was up to something. His behavior was too restrained, as if he was waiting for the right moment to speak. You have a real treasure trove up here, he remarked, looking around. He was holding an old box of yellowed photographs. Have you ever thought about how many memories are hidden in places like this? I have, I replied, taking the box from him. Although sometimes it's easier to leave the past in the past. It reminds you of itself too often as it is. Scott looked at me as if my words raised more questions for him than answers. What if the past doesn't return just for no reason? He asked. Sometimes it comes back to remind you of what you missed. I froze in place, feeling something inside tighten. His words sounded strange, as if he wasn't talking about the box of photographs, but about me. I pretended not to give it much thought, but he continued. Everyone has a choice. Sometimes we live as though this is the only possible path. But in reality, he set the box down on the floor, crossing his arms. Have you ever thought that you could live differently? Where did you get that from? I asked sharply, suddenly feeling uncomfortable. I'm fine with everything. Maybe, he replied, not taking his attentive eyes off me. But your face says otherwise. You look like you don't even believe in yourself. I didn't know how to respond. His words hit a nerve. How could he know? I wasn't fully satisfied with my life, but I tried not to think about it, convincing myself that everything was fine. Scott picked up another box and set it next to the first one. He spoke again as if his words had no purpose other than casual musings. Mike said you've always been special. Rebellious, stubborn. He admired that. It's strange that now you're trying to hide that part of yourself. You talk about me a lot, even though you've only known me for a couple of days, I said, trying to sound calm. I just observe. He smiled. Sometimes it's easier to see things from the outside. We continued working in silence, but each of his words echoed in my head. He was asking the questions I had been afraid to ask myself. What do I want? Am I happy with my life? Why have my dreams been buried under layers of dust for so long, just like these old boxes in the attic? When we came back downstairs, Scott smiled and casually walked towards the yard to help Mike. I stayed in the hallway, feeling two emotions battling within me: irritation and gratitude. Irritation at his bluntness, gratitude for saying aloud what I had been ignoring for so long. Now I looked at Scott differently. There was a challenge in his words. There was sincerity in his gaze. And I understood that he could see me in a way I had long stopped seeing myself. On Saturday morning, Alex suggested having a picnic in the backyard to celebrate the first results of Mike and Scott's work. They had cleared most of the yard, fixed the old fence, and even started marking the area for the future rest zone. Everyone liked the idea of a picnic, and by noon, the hot day was filled with the smell of charcoal and laughter. Alex and Mike took charge of the barbecue. They were animatedly discussing the best way to marinate the meat, as if their honor depended on it. I stood by the table with snacks, arranging bread and vegetables. Meanwhile, Scott was fiddling with a small portable table, which, for some reason, refused to stand firmly on the uneven ground. A picnic is always an adventure. He smirked, straightening up and wiping his hands on his jeans. Sometimes even an ordinary table can surprise you. That's for sure, I replied, trying not to make eye contact with him. After our conversation in the attic, I felt vulnerable in his presence. We all sat down at the makeshift table. Mike began telling an old story about the time he tried to teach me how to swim in a mountain river, but ended up nearly drowning himself, getting tangled in the weeds. I laughed, remembering how he spent the rest of the day grumbling about never going into the water again. She made me a promise back then, Mike said with affection, that she would be the first girl in our family not only to swim but also to win first place in a competition. He looked at me warmly. And what do you think? A year later, she won the local tournament. Well, I just didn't want to see you disappointed, I joked. Everyone laughed, but in that moment, I caught Scott's gaze. He wasn't laughing. He was just watching me intently, as if trying to figure out what was really hidden behind my smile. I quickly looked away. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire that Alex had lit under the old oak tree. The flames crackled, pushing away the chill of the night. Mike began telling stories again, this time lighter ones, recalling his youthful adventures. Alex laughed so genuinely that I couldn't help but smile, watching him. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen him so relaxed. So, Alex, Scott suddenly asked, interrupting Mike's playful tale. His voice was calm, but the question was unexpected. What do you dream of? Alex hesitated for a moment, then, smiling, replied, to be honest, my biggest dream is for everything to stay the same. Stability, comfort, peace. I think that's the most important thing. I noticed that Scott briefly glanced at me but didn't say anything. Instead, he asked, and you? What do you dream of? I knew the question was for me, but answering was harder than I expected. I was silent for a few seconds, listening to the wind rustling the leaves above our heads. Probably to find something of my own, something that makes me feel alive. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I immediately regretted saying them. Scott nodded, as if he had expected such an answer. Alex looked at me, surprised, but didn't say anything. At that moment, I realized that an invisible barrier had formed between us. Alex was living the dream of stability, and I didn't even know what I wanted. As the campfire began to die down, Scott pulled me aside, under the pretense of needing to take the empty basket back to its place. You know, he said when we moved away from the others, your words today were the first honest answer you've given all this time. What do you mean? I asked, trying to sound indifferent. I mean that you want more than you have now. It's obvious. Just don't be afraid to admit it to yourself. I didn't know how to respond. Scott's words sounded almost like a challenge, but I felt that he was right. When Alex and I were cleaning the house, he suddenly asked, "What's going on with you? You haven't been yourself lately?" I tried to brush it off. "I'm fine, just tired." But he didn't back down. "You've been avoiding me all day. Is it because of Mike or Scott? You can see that something's wrong." The words came out unexpectedly harsh, and I couldn't take it anymore. Everything's become predictable, Alex. We're living in circles as if nothing more exists. I want to feel like I'm alive. Alex froze, stunned. "Do you think I'm not trying?" "All of this is for us." "I know," I replied, struggling to hold back tears. But I can't ignore anymore that something has changed inside me. He didn't say anything, just turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the empty room, filled with the echo of our words. Later that evening, when Alex was still avoiding talking to me, I decided to speak with Mike. We were sitting on the porch, wrapped in warm blankets. In the darkness, his face looked more tired than usual, and there was an underlying worry in his eyes. "Mike," I began carefully, "you didn't come here just for a visit, did you? Something is going on?" He was silent for a long time, as if weighing every word, and then sighed. "Yes, you're right. I didn't just decide to visit you. There's something I should have told you a long time ago." My heart stopped, and I felt a growing unease in my chest. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mike hesitated, then looked me straight in the eyes. "When your father passed away, I didn't just help you. I also tried to sort out his affairs. That's when I found out something. About his old partners, about the money that was missing. Scott was part of that story. We both tried to protect you, but I was afraid to talk about it." "Protect? From what?" My voice trembled. "From problems that could have dragged you into them, too. Back then, we managed to keep it all hidden, but now something from the past has surfaced again. That's why I brought Scott. He knows more than I do." I looked at Mike, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. Everything I thought I knew about my past suddenly seemed much more complicated. The next day, when Alex went out for groceries, I was left alone at home with Mike and Scott. I could no longer stand the unspoken tension in the air, and when Scott sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, I decided to take action. "We need to talk," I said, walking closer. He looked at me, showing neither surprise nor resistance. It seemed like he had been waiting for this moment. "Mike said you know more than I do. Tell me everything. I'm tired of being in the dark." Scott silently took a sip, then set the cup down on the railing. "All right," he replied calmly. "But what you're about to hear may change the way you see the past." I sat down beside him, feeling a chill run down my spine. "When your father was alive, he was in business with partners who weren't as honest as they seemed. They got him involved in things he didn't suspect until the very end. When he realized what had happened, it was too late. His name was tied to major schemes. Mike decided to intervene to protect you and your mother." "And you were part of this?" I asked, barely keeping my voice steady. Scott nodded. "Yes. I helped Mike cover the tracks to keep your family out of it. We did everything to shield you from the consequences." "Why did you stay silent all these years?" I asked, feeling my throat dry up. "We thought the story was over," Scott answered. "But recently someone started showing interest in those old dealings. That's why we're here, to make sure you're safe." I didn't know what to say. My past had suddenly turned into a tangled web of secrets and decisions that had been made behind my back. I stood up, feeling a tremor run through my body. "And what am I supposed to do with this now?" I asked. Scott looked me in the eye. "Just live. We'll sort it out. But you need to know this. Mike has done a lot for you, even kept the truth from you." In the evening, when everyone had gathered in the house, I realized I could no longer leave things as they were. Too much had been left unsaid, and now I needed to know the full truth. I invited Mike and Scott to talk, trying to remain calm, though inside I was trembling. "We need to discuss everything right now," I said, looking at both of them. Alex stood a little to the side, watching me with surprise. He didn't know what had been happening the last few days, but he sensed that something serious was going on. Mike sighed and sat down on the couch, gesturing for Scott to follow him. He looked tired, but didn't resist. "All right," he said. "Ask away." I looked at them, then at Alex. He was my husband, but I didn't know how he would react to all of this. Finally, I spoke. "You've been hiding the truth from me for all these years. About my father, about those deals you covered up. Why? Why did you think I shouldn't know?" Mike covered his face with his hands and quietly said, "We thought we were protecting you. You were just a child back then. And later, we were afraid that the truth would break you." Scott, who had been silent up until now, added, "But things are different now. The people who have brought up this story are looking for any lead. We're here to make sure you don't get hurt." "Who are these people?" Alex asked, finally speaking up. His voice was firm, but I could see he was struggling to keep his worry in check. "Your father's old partners," Mike answered. "Some of them haven't let it go and decided to track down what they think was lost. Money, documents, we're not sure exactly, but it could affect all of you." The silence in the room became deafening. I looked at Mike and Scott, feeling a mix of anger, confusion, and relief. Finally, everything was falling into place. But what now? "You say you're protecting me," I said quietly. "But do you know what worries me most? That you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth sooner? I'm not a child, Mike. I should have known." Mike raised his eyes to meet mine, and there was pain in his gaze. "You're right," he admitted. "We did what we thought was right at the time. But maybe it was a mistake." Scott nodded, confirming his words. "We didn't want to drag you into this, but now everything's out in the open. You need to know. And if it comes to it, we'll be here for you." I turned my gaze to Alex. He was anxious, but trying to stay calm. He came over to me, took my hand, and quietly said, "We'll handle this. Together." Those words gave me strength. I realized that despite all the secrets, fears, and mistrust, I still had support. And I wasn't alone in this complicated story. The next day, after the long, intense conversation, everything suddenly seemed surprisingly clear. I woke up with a feeling that the weight that had been pressing on me for the last few days had finally started to lift. The truth was still bitter, but it was better than lies or unspoken words. Alex, noticing that I seemed more at ease, suggested we spend the morning together. We had coffee on the terrace, enjoying the silence. His gaze was soft, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry about yesterday," he said, taking my hand. "I reacted badly. I'm just afraid we might lose what we have." "I was scared too," I admitted. "But Alex, we can't live as if we're afraid of change. If something's wrong, it's not the end. It's an opportunity to fix things." He nodded, and I saw understanding in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, we were speaking openly, not afraid to hurt each other. By evening, Mike and Scott were preparing to leave. Mike came up to me, hugged me like he had when I was a child, and quietly said, "You're stronger than you think, and smarter than I sometimes gave you credit for. I'm sorry I didn't trust you. I'm proud of you." I smiled through my tears. "Thank you for everything, Mike, and for being there when it mattered most." Scott also came over to say goodbye. His gaze was as calm and slightly mysterious as always. "You've got a lot of work ahead of you," he said with a slight smile. "But it seems like you've already figured out where your strength lies." I didn't answer. I just nodded, knowing he was right. The next day, Alex and I made an important decision. We decided to take a short trip. Not to escape, but to look at everything from a new perspective. We wanted to feel again that life wasn't just the usual cycle of concerns, but also an opportunity to dream, to find ourselves. When Mike's van disappeared around the corner, I felt a lightness. The past had reminded me of itself, but now I knew. It wouldn't control my future. This was a new chapter. For me, for Alex, for us. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready for it. When Mike and Scott's van disappeared over the horizon, I was still standing on the porch, feeling a light breeze on my face. Alex had gone inside to gather the last things for our trip, but I couldn't bring myself to tear my gaze away from the road. Inside, a sense of calm battled with a strange feeling, as if something had been left unsaid. My gaze accidentally fell on the wooden table by the entrance, where a small note was lying. It was unexpected, as no one had left anything. I picked it up, unfolded it, and recognized Scott's handwriting. Don't forget that the past rarely lets us go easily. If you feel like something is wrong again, know that Mike and I are here. P.S. Answers aren't always where we look for them. My heart began to race. What did he mean by that? Was it really over? Or could these people who started digging into my father's past still come back? I went back inside, trying to pull myself together. Alex, seeing me with the note, asked, "Is everything okay?" I remained silent for a long moment, then said, "Yeah, just thinking about what's ahead for us." He hugged me and confidently said, "Whatever it is, we'll handle it. The most important thing is that we're together." But inside, I knew. This story wasn't over. Perhaps it was just beginning.